And so ended the 1981 rally season, a year when the new mingled with the old, when the supercars of the future began to show their mettle, but a year when the old brigade still scooped the major honours. 1981 will best be remembered as a pointer of things to come on the rally scene, an indicator of the drivers and the cars to watch in 1982. The thing about rallying has always been that it's the driver that counts. And despite the increasing accent on technical improvements, tyre compounds, spring rates and so on, this still applies today. So let's start our look at the year by assessing the drivers. One man who knows them better than most and who has sat alongside the new world champion Ari Vatanen throughout his champion year is David Richards. How does he rate today's men?
It's been quite a unique year in that different drivers have won virtually every round. It's only Ari that's pulled off 3 wins during the year, and every other round's been won by a different driver. So I think that highlights the talent that there is about at the moment and just how equal many of the drivers are. Monte Carlo, you had the Frenchman Ragnotti. Of course, the Audis were leading and doing very well, and Mikola, of course, but Ragnotti really proved his consistency and gave the Renault its first success, which was very interesting. Then, of course, Hannu went on to Sweden and proved just that for a driver who's been around for quite many years now, and with this new motor car, he's probably the fastest in the world at the moment, coupled with the motor car, of course.
Having built up and then lost a commanding lead on the Monte, Mikola brought the Audi Quattro to the snows of Sweden, determined to prove the car was a force and one to be reckoned with. The Swedish is a sprint event, and with 100% ice and snow route, no test of a car's endurance. It is a driver's event, and Hannu led from the start, soon building up a comfortable buffer of 3 or 4 minutes, a position from which he was able to control proceedings behind him. Here it proved to be a super result for the Rothmans escorts, which finished 2nd and 3rd in the hands of Vatanen and Auricula. Behind them came Anders Kulang, still driving the Works Ascona 400, and another local, Bjorn Johansson, in the Swedish dealer team Ascona. The blue of Kulang's car signifies the sponsorship of Problemo, a Monegasque property outfit who seemed in Sweden to be sponsoring every car in sight. There was Kulang's Opel, Blomqvist's Saab, a works car on loan, as Saab had officially withdrawn from the sport after the RAC. Eklund's own 911 Porsche, Ingvar Carlsson's BMW. Such manna from heaven was too good to last, and by the time the Safari arrived, the bubble had burst, and Problemo were in liquidation, with a mountain of unpaid sponsorship debts outstanding. This meant a sudden acute shortage of funds for Tony Fall's Opel team, and Kulang was released to find work elsewhere. The Swedish is run in the western half of central Sweden, and comes pretty close to the Norwegian border. The Norwegians, starved of rallying in their own country, come over in hordes, many of them the worse for vodka. And Swedes share many a joke and caustic comment at their expense. Ironically, just the same happens in Finland at the time of the 1000 Lakes. But here it's the Swedes who are on the receiving end. Because of unusually mild weather, the traditional frozen river stage at Stulit had to be moved this year, as the snowplow carving out the track fell through the ice only 5 kilometers downstream from here. This was the first time ever that a non-Swede had triumphed in this event, and the traditional home domination was well and truly shattered by a Finnish 1-2-3.
In Portugal, Marco Alen, again, he's been a great rival of ours for some time, and despite the car being aged a little bit, it's very similar to the Escort in many ways, Marco is quite an adversary, and I think in the new cars, the new generation of cars for the future, he's going to come out as probably the top, or very close to it anyway. After that you had Corsica, and always French dominated, of course, Corsica, and Petit Darniche isn't seen on more events outside his home country because given the right motor car and the right conditions, he is the equal of virtually everybody. Acropolis, of course, that was our event, and that was quite rewarding to go back there for a second year and win that. Missed out Safari, of course, Shekameta, long distance type rallies. As you get a little bit older, it seems you go off to do the long distance rallies. Sheka's always dominated them, and a third year win on Safari was quite a feat, I think, and anyone who goes to the African events can't discount Sheka. You must put him as almost favourite. South America, really, well, that was left to Freckelen and ourselves to go down there. We didn't have a lot of competition down there, and Freckelen proved his consistency. He's just being there all year, picking up seconds, third places, and of course in Argentina he came good at the end and picked up a win, and I think very deservedly so as well. Thousand Lakes, well, again, that was a victory for ourselves, which was very rewarding. That's the rally of the year from our point of view, I think.
Finland in August can only mean one thing: the magnificent rally of the Thousand Lakes. Once again, the pre-rally talking point was whether anyone could possibly stay with Mikkola in the Quattro. The opposition lined up against them was the most formidable seen so far. There was Markku Alain, last year's winner in a Fiat Arbeth 131, a Thousand Lakes specialist if ever there was one. There was Ari Vatanen, Mikkola's prodigy, in the first of the Rothmans escorts. There was rising talent Henri Toivonen in the Works Talbot. Two more Quattros for Michel Mouton and Franz Wittmann. A team of three smart new Colt Lancer turbos returning after a dismal debut on the Acropolis with drivers Kulang, Antero Leiner and Kiosto Hämäläinen. Non-playing captain was Andrew Cowan, a long-distance man not likely to show well on this type of event, where local knowledge is gained through years of daily drifting over the dirt roads, which predominate in this part of Finland. Eklund ran his own Porsche again, as Valdegaard was the Toyota driver on World Championship events. Datsun had Salonen, Pitkinen and Geitel. So there was plenty of talent waiting to pick up the running should Mikkola falter. And falter he did, or rather the car started to misfire. And after the town stage, which traditionally precedes the second leg, a camshaft change was decided upon by the Audi team. This complicated job, carried out by the side of the road, cost road penalties and pushed Hanu back into fifth place, a position from which, on such a short event, there was little prospect of recovery. Meanwhile, Alain and Vatanen waged a fast and furious battle, highlighted by Alain's various spins and a roll on the first night. Vatanen, though, was at his most mature, and profiting by Alain's indiscretions, came home with his and the team's finest win to date. His third outright win of the championship, and one to put him close enough to Freckelen for there to be a cliff-hanging finale to the season's end.
San Remo, well, that must be history in the making. Now you have to put in your list of drivers a lady, and that really makes quite a change. When did we last do that? Pat Moss, I guess. But Michel, you can chat to any of the drivers. You chat to Hanu, Markku, Bjorn, a lot, and they all sort of rate her in amongst them, and she is a very tenacious driver. She's just so determined to win. I've got great admiration for her. And into Bandama, we had Timo Salonen, somebody who's very underestimated. He's always had Datsun cars, which, despite their reliability, aren't the most competitive vehicle, and he turned up trumps in Bandama, and I think, again, put him in a quicker car next year, and Datsun are developing further and further, and I really do rate him very, very highly.
All hinged on the RAC. Freckelen was, by now, the outside chance, as Ari only had to beat him and finish in the top 5 to take the crown. Both of them started cautiously, anxious not to ruin their chances by a silly too early in the event, especially on those Mickey Mouse spectator stages, which are a feature of the first day. By nightfall, Vatanen was a lowly 17th, with Freckelen even further back at 26th. Once the forests were reached, Ari got into his stride and was quickly up to contest second place with Tony Pond. A 2.5 minute off in Hamsterley dropped him to third, But Pond retired soon afterwards, leaving Arry a secure second, but with no chance of taking time off Michelin. In the same way, Frekela was equally impotent, knowing, as he started the final Welsh loop in 10th place, that any chance he had of the world title now depended more on misfortune hitting Vatanen than anything he could do. In the event, it was he who retired, going off here at Burwarton, and then again in the dark, backwards on Dovey. This time crushing a petrol pipe, causing enough fuel starvation for he and Jean Todt to call it a day and ensure Arry the championship. The World Drivers' Championship is a relatively new institution, and alarmingly, a pattern seems to be developing in which the current world champion spends his championship year in the wilderness. Bjorn Valdegaard struggled with an uncompetitive Celica in his championship year, though he did manage to lead the RAC in it for a brief while. And this year, the 1980 champion Walter Röhrl has made only occasional appearances at the wheel of various elderly or underdeveloped Porsches, though his efforts on the Manx were a delight to watch, and it seems that with no Ford to drive, Arry will take the early part of next year off, assume the sidelines, and await the arrival of Ford's answer to the age of the supercar. It seems unimaginable that when it finally appears in action, it won't be a major force. Ford's now extended history of producing winning rally cars surely won't allow them to sire a pup.
The rest, Toivonen is the obvious young one who's must be on the verge of rarely coming on to World Championship Rally. He's still 25 years old, 26 years old, and I really do think you're going to see him pick up a few World Championships in the very near future. He's just been close this year. He's had second places and he's been there at sort of Monte Carlo Rally and various other events, but never quite there. But I think, you know, he still needs another year of experience, and then you're really going to see him coming being right up the top. Bjorn Valdegaard, again, he's had a lot of bad luck this year driving the Toyota, but he's somebody, one of the most professional drivers around, and you've got to rate him very, very highly. So I don't know whether I've missed anyone. He's so easy, and Kulang, he again, very, very talented driver, just hasn't had the right motor cars and the right opportunities this year. But as I say, you've got a list of drivers now that are very equal, and I think the new cars, the quick Group B cars, when they come, I think they will perhaps show up some differences. Those things are going to be so quick, so difficult to drive. I think it's going to be interesting to see who can really get to grips with 350, 400 possibly brake horsepower.
We will take a look at the cars themselves and at the manufacturer's title in a while. But for now, let's continue on the driver's theme and turn our attentions to the British Open Championship. And for once, this has been dominated by British drivers Tony Pond and Jimmy McRae. John Horton of the dealer Opel team takes up the story.
I suppose the main feature this year, obviously it gives me a certain amount of pleasure to say, is that there's been a return to motorsport, successful motorsport for General Motors in the form of the Vauxhall Chevette and the Opel Ascona 400. It's been a few years since General Motors enjoyed success on the Opel side, for instance. I suppose we have to look back to 1978 with Brian Kulcheth in the Group 1 Cadet GTE, when from 7 starts he had 7 Group 1 wins. But I suppose the critics will say a driver of Kulcheth's ability in such a small car, and perhaps a class not so hotly contested, some would say, it was not a difficult feat. But even so, I think McRae's achievements this year in not finishing lower than 3rd in any of the 5 events has really set a standard that other drivers will try and achieve in the future. But apart from the successes which we've enjoyed as a very small British team, I think there's certain highlights of the event have made it quite a memorable year. If someone asks you, can you remember all 5 events in the championship? And you say, well, I think the Mintex was in February and the Welsh was okay. But to me, I can look back at those 5 events and say, yes, there were elements which will make 1981 a very special year. The Mintex, firstly, the conditions that the drivers had to face, the ice and snow. I'm sure Pentti Rikkilä, just back from the Swedish rally, must have been very grateful for all that ice and snow everywhere. And it obviously brought out his Scandinavian upbringing to absolute best possible form, because he was uncatchable. McRae said to me, he tried and he tried again, and he kept on trying, but he just couldn't live with the Rikkilä. And at a point when they were pulling so far ahead of the rest of the field, there was no point perhaps in trying too hard, because a championship of only 5 events, you can't really afford to drop any points. So McRae was satisfied with second. But the other element, apart from the conditions, had to be the driver, Austin McHale, the young Dubliner, in a car perhaps not the most expensive of Group 1 cars we've seen in recent years, but nevertheless driven with an amount of panache and verve that we haven't seen in a long time. I think it's almost as if he was expecting talent scouts from the other teams to be watching the Mintex, because he drove a superb event. And when you think that he's not a Forest driver, he's more akin to driving on the Irish Tarmac Championship, then all credit to him for adapting so quickly and so professionally to a very different environment. And all credit to his co-driver, having sat on those long Dalby straights at what must have been an eternity in a Group 1 car. But a superb event. The Mintex, unfortunately, always seems to have its unfair share of problems, but out of those problems there came a superb event. All credit to them for salvaging it in such atrocious weather conditions, and what a superb drive for Penty and for Austin McHale. The next event, of course, which we all look forward to, because it's the event which has the two classic elements, closed roads and open bars, the Circuit of Ireland. I think caught out a lot of drivers unawares this year. It really should be a World Championship rally. 500 stage miles in some of the best and most demanding roads in Europe. And it really deserves a lot of respect, and drivers coming along thinking, oh well, we'll just potter around this, it's another British sprint event, had a sad awakening for them. And those that arrived in Killarney, I think, certainly had a lot more respect for the run back to Belfast than they had when they started out of Belfast 2 days before.
It was Pond who set the pace from the start, building a lead on the first day, whilst the competition, Penty in particular, busied themselves visiting the Irish scenery. John Lyon's knowledge of the little lanes of Ulster shows well in his first day attack. Early next morning, Pond goes out with transmission failure, leaving Jimmy in a secure lead, and only Russell Brooks, a firm favourite with the mad-keen Irish spectators, with any real chance of catching him. For 2 days, Russell chased hard, enjoying every minute of this Easter Classic. And then, on the 4th day of the rally, and halfway back to Belfast, he hit an unarrowed Galway bank and bananaed the little Talbot. He made it to the finish in 3rd place, but the crash removed any chances of a win. Jimmy, for his part, took his Opel to its first international win, and his 2nd consecutive circuit win. He hardly put a foot wrong, and this brief visit to the boondocks on Sugar Hill was virtually his only off-road excursion in 5 days of hard driving.
Despite the troubles, the people are there, the welcome is as warm as some of the breaks at the end of the Killarney run. But a super event, and really one that, if I had to choose personally one event in the whole championship which I would like to compete on, either as a driver or a co-driver, I'm sorry, but it would have to be the circuit, because it really is so demanding and so challenging. On the other hand, if I was asked to choose a gravel rally, then we have to look at the Welsh rally, the next round after the Circuit of Ireland. The Welsh, it was full of incident throughout, as it always is. They're classic Welsh stages, they're very fast, they're very smooth, the speeds are high, and the drivers tend to get a rhythm, a flow for these stages. But when we got into Minepant, it was a different story. Harry Vatanen, who was fighting tooth and nail with Tony Pond and Jimmy McRae for the lead, had unfortunately a wrong choice in tyres. It was a question of choosing tyres a long time before they reached the stages, and the weather conditions change, as they often do quite dramatically on those high military roads. When Vatanen came to the start of the stage on the wrong tyres, Tim Bryce, driving a similar car, very sportingly swapped tyres with him, which is no mean feat with 2 side jacks and 2 co-drivers working with wheel braces. But that just brought home to me the loyalty that there is in the Ford camp, the loyalty between 2 drivers who are still competing against each other, even though they're representing the same brand, if you like. And that really, I think, was all credit to Tim Bryce for being so sporting. And again, it brings out the character of most of the drivers in this sport. That's the tenacity to win, the will to win is always there, but they'll never forget a helping hand when it's needed most. The Welsh, I said, is a classic. It's good, fast-flowing stages which the drivers enjoy. A trip to Aviemore via Glasgow in June, and then you got something different again. Some of the toughest stages in the British Isles. Again, like the circuit, an event that needs the respect of the drivers, needs a good, strong car. And despite that, the speeds of the Scottish were just as high, if not higher than ever before. What we saw there was the classic GM battle resume, Pond versus McRae. Those two have a tremendous rapport away from the cars, away from the stages. It's a bit like a very well-rehearsed comedy act, but those two in cars must have set those forests alight. I mean, the spectators are coming back with the stories of cars going so quickly that it was just totally mind-boggling. It really was a race. And in the race to keep up with them, in the championship race with Malcolm Wilson, Pedro Rickard, unfortunately the pace got a bit too hot and quite uncharacteristically, but on the other hand, coincidentally, they both apparently tipped their cars into the same ditch on the same stage, which goes to show that the Rothmans' planning is down to the finest detail. I'm sure they wouldn't appreciate the humour, perhaps, certainly not on the day. But it was an event where McRae and Pond dominated, and they really didn't take heed of the fact there'd been a gap between the Scottish and the Manx, because when they came over to the Isle of Man, that battle resumed, and that was some battle royal.
The fifth and final round, the fabulous Rothmans Manx, the only tarmac pace note event we have. Closed public roads, a holiday island and sunny weather, all the ingredients for rallying at its best. Rothmans had imported some Continentals to give the event more status and perhaps up its rating in the European Championship coefficient stakes. There was a fantastic Walter Röhrl in the Porsche, and Belgians Robert Droogmans and Didi all helping to build the event into something really special. And special it was too, because Tony Pond, now the uncrowned king of the island, showed a clean pair of Chevette heels to everyone, but not without effort to begin with. Tony had a high-speed spin on the first stage, handing the lead to Röhrl, who, on his first visit to Man, and with only a few days' practice behind him, was very, very quick. On the night section, Pond really let them have it with both barrels, and emerged from that leg in a lead he was never to lose. But he was pushed all the way by McRae, free of his championship worries, and by Röhrl, faster again, now that daylight allowed him to see where he was. A pity, therefore, that within sight of the finish, his car should fail him. The Porsche broke a drive shaft only 400 yards from the end of the last stage. The crews had come to the island with the championship still undecided. McRae was in the lead, but Auricular had a chance if he could beat Jimmy. As it happened, this battle fizzled out as Penty hit the iron bridge at Sulby on stage 3, broke off a wheel, ran as far as he could on the disc and retired. We were denied a championship race, but this did allow Jimmy to let his hair down and enliven the battle for the lead. Jimmy is a fine and worthy champion, and it'll be a pity if he is not seen in more world-class events next year. General Motors made a real success of the championship, as Pond's efforts netted them the manufacturer section for Vauxhall.
But those two drivers had really put British drivers on the map, and if anything, that's what we need. Perhaps it's unfair that team managers recruit drivers if they have a Scandinavian-sounding name, and if you're world champion, you're on a pedestal, and you're going to be the Aunt Sally. Someone's going to knock you off. And how pleasant and how pleasing it was, and satisfying, to be a British team on an event where two British drivers took the cream of European rallying by the scruff of the neck and really showed them the way home. I think the quote of the rally has to go to Pond. He said to Mike Nicholson as they came down before the evening run, "I'm going to take you around this island faster than you've ever been before." And by Jove, Nicholson knew about that when he came back. It's been a mixed year, a lot of mixed fortunes. It's highlighted that the events, 5 events, aren't really enough for a championship in some ways. If you have a bad score, it really leaves you at a disadvantage. The drivers who really have persevered and turned in a good show despite their problems, I suppose, have been Russell Brooks and Per Eklund. Russell, always the man to watch out for on the circuit of Ireland. Again, has tremendous respect for the event and is always guaranteed to go well. And just an unfortunate, well, minor off really, hitting a bank but knocking the steering out of line enough to slow him down and damaging the car enough to lose him time on the stage. Very sad, but he still managed third place overall. I'm sure that it would have been a real fight to the end if he'd have kept going on the circuit, because Jimmy McRae really was having to keep an eye out for Russell. He was the main threat. Russell, having had problems on the Mintex, he could have been forgiven for not really trying too hard on the circuit to try and consolidate some points. But that's not Russell. His tenacity and his will to win is always there. And he never really, apart from being an ultra-professional, he never forgets people. He always has time for the autograph, for the children, very conscious. I think he's one of the best value for sponsors that anyone could ask for. A great ambassador, always the gentleman, and yet always totally understanding with everything that's going on. Russell, I imagine, if Mike Broad ever got out of the car on the circuit because he found a pub that sold cheap Guinness, I'm sure Russell would quite adequately cope with getting himself around navigation-wise and driving. He's that sort of guy. He can adapt to any circumstance. What I admire about Russell is, for instance, on the Scottish a few years ago, on the Scottish, he tipped the car over completely. It was all a hell of a mess, and he still got the thing to the end and won. He will never give up. If he's got three wheels and drive, he'll keep going. And you've got to admire someone like that. Not his best year. The Manx was an early retirement. The Scottish was a retirement as well. But there again, something like Russell will always be good value. He'll always be top of the list of any team manager's chart when it comes to looking for a driver who's good in the forest and is good for the mark. His personality and his attention to promoting his product and his sponsors' well-being is always there, and he will always, I'm sure, do very well. Malcolm Wilson, on the other hand, a similar sort of year, unfortunately. It's taken Malcolm to go into Europe to show some of the mettle, some of the real fire he's got in him. I'm sure that the accident on the Scottish a year ago hasn't done a great deal for him. He's got to come back and build back up slowly to the speed he used to drive at. But there again, isn't that a mark of maturity? That shows really that he's learnt something by his mistake, and it will take time, but I'm sure that he still is going to be one of the best properties that British rallying has brought up in the last few years. Again, always a trier. He never gives up. He's had some problems this year. On the Mintex he went off, and in getting back on, Russell had to go off avoiding him. But those sort of problems, well, they do happen, and he gets over them. But I would like to see Malcolm had a better year, because we do really need to show the national press and the media that we are building and breeding some good British drivers. But he'll be there. And the young finds, well, McHale started, as they say, like a lion and perhaps finished like a lamb, although he took the Group 1 award on the Manx Trophy Rally. Perhaps the Mintex result unnerved him. That's the only way I can describe it. Perhaps he wasn't quite ready for so much success so early. If, like Mike Stewart, he'd approached it a little bit more steadily, as Mike took the championship on consistency and some good results. Let's not forget that Mike took Group 1 on the circuit of Ireland on Austin's home patch, because again, I think Austin was going perhaps too hard, too long. He had a good lead, he could have eased off. But that's when Mike's perhaps young years but mature head on young shoulders paid off, and all credit to him. And again, someone who really should deserve some support from a British-based company. Mike Stewart, very good value, and I hope that when the RSC comes around and he gets his Group 4 drive, the results will be there to prove the point. Of course, he drove Group 4 on the Manx, drove very, very sensibly, made a top 10 position, and I think that was good. He could have been forgiven for going out to try and lead on the first day and then retire, but he didn't. He wanted the place, because to finish events is experience, and young drivers need experience far more than flash-in-the-pan results. The other young finds, I don't think we've had a real new face in the Open Championship. I'm sad to say, because we do really need people to follow on now. We need people to serve their apprenticeship on the British Championship. But there again, the Championship has become expensive. There's no doubting that at all. I think when times get a little bit better and the traditional companies, the oil companies, the tyre companies, the manufacturers can find a bit more budget, then I think they'll go back to supporting the up-and-coming British driver, and that'll be a good day when that happens. But the rest of the year, I suppose, as a championship, credit must be given to Rothmans for the amount of effort they've put into the championship. Not for their own return. I mean, they're there obviously for that, to create awareness of Rothmans as a company. But they've done so much more for British rallying, for the sport, which everyone complains there's not enough TV, radio, newspaper time. They've done a lot and spent a lot of time and effort in getting the sport accepted. People like David Vine they've brought in to produce superb pre-event rally shows and prize givings, to do really interesting interviews. It's all helped to bring the sport out of its tradition of being what it is. It's a sport organised by amateurs, often at their expense and in their time, for the benefit of professionals. And I think Rothmans is doing a lot to help redress that balance, because we desperately need to be very professional in everything we do.
...1981 has really been about just one car, this, the Audi Quattro. Not because it won the World Manufacturers' Championship, that would have been too much to expect in its first season, but because when it was going, it was literally unbeatable. How much was this due to the car, and how much the drivers? This is an important question, because teams trying to develop a car to compete with it for next year need to know how good the car is, undistorted by the relative drivers' abilities. How much of the Quattro's supremacy arises from the fact that it's probably being driven by the world's fastest driver? Denying Mikola's supremacy and arguing that if a mere woman, can win a World Championship rally in it, it must be the car, is too simple an answer. We've already heard from David Richards the effect that all the world-class drivers reckon Mouton is very much on their level. and no one would deny this of Mikola. So maybe the Quattro isn't so much faster than the opposition after all, and it's really a question of a good car and good drivers. There are certainly some fantastic advantages going for it, but also some marked disadvantages. Tight hairpins are a case in point. You can't handbrake it, you can't invoke tail slide using the throttle, so the only way around is in a series of power on, power off lurches, which doesn't look fast, but it can be effective. Take this hairpin at Weston Park on the RAC. Mikola goes round in 3 seconds dead, Mouton 3.2, and Pond's tail happy attitude, very effective because he put up the fastest time on the stage, also 3.2. On the other hand, on inferior surfaces, the getaway advantage is quite enormous. Here in Sweden, Mikola took 5 seconds off the field in little more than 50 metres. So is four-wheel drive the only way to go? Possibly, but for tarmac, I feel the mid-engined device is probably going to be more effective. The Renault 5 Turbo is the first example of the breed, and its power-to-weight ratio is probably slightly better than the Audi. As soon as the going gets slippy or sticky though, the four-wheel drive advantages really come to the fore. When you've got the best power-to-weight ratio around, and the means of putting it on the ground through all four wheels, then you can put up with a few slow corners now and again.
The little Coventry team of Talbot and their Sunbeam Lotus have been riding the crest of a wave lately, despite a very slender budget, the threat of closure within the Peugeot empire, and an ever-drooping share of the British car market. How different from the days when the Roots Group Sunbeam Rapiers were the British rally team par excellence. In spite of all this, Des O'Dell and his boys began the year with the victory trumpets in Bath still ringing in their ears. Henri Toivonen's remarkable victory on the 1980 RAC gave them a boost, on which they have continued to thrive, and they have ended 1981 with the World Manufacturers' Championship. There is nothing outstanding about the car, but it and its Lotus engine are remarkably reliable, and the car handles well. Freckler has been the most successful Talbot driver of the year, with second places on the Monte Carlo, in Corsica and Brazil, a win in Argentina and points in Portugal, Greece and the Ivory Coast. Toivonen's wins have been confined to minor events in Finland, and second places in Portugal and on the San Remo. Stig Blomqvist appeared on the Thousand Lakes in a Swedish-entered car, finished 8th and was rewarded with a works drive on the RAC. The only Talbot to finish, a fine 3rd place. It was just what was needed to seal the championship. Talbot's main competition came from Datsun, who, following a win on the Safari and a fine second for Tony Pond in Corsica, started to challenge Talbot's point score. The Safari result could be expected, for if anything at all, the Datsun is a long-distance enduro machine. But for Pond to bring one home in second place around all those twists in Corsica was quite remarkable. Next year, Pond has signed to do an extensive season of World Championship events for Datsun, and his efforts in world-class company will be followed with interest. Timo Salonen ended the year on a high note for Datsun, with a win on the Bandama Rally on the Ivory Coast. There are still more examples of Ford Escorts campaigning in all classes of rallying than any other model. But for the manufacturers, the situation must be increasingly embarrassing, as the rear-wheel drive Escort has now been out of production for over 2 years. In the hands of the David Sutton Equipe, the cars have been well prepared, have carried the new World Championship to his title, but have received virtually no specification changes since Ford all but disowned them. It will be at least midsummer before we see a new Ford in action. Renault's efforts with the 5 Turbo started with a win on the Monte Carlo and then petered out, their resources being concentrated on Grand Prix racing. So the potential of this little projectile has still to be really exploited. Perhaps their exploratory venture into the British forest on the RAC, rewarded with an unexpected 5th place, will encourage them to take rallying more seriously. Welshman John Price has campaigned a customer example privately in Britain, and this immaculately presented car has been a delight to watch. We mentioned the plight of the Germany-based Opel Works team earlier, and since the non-appearance of the Publimo sponsorship money, Tony Fall has had to content himself with overseeing the efforts of the various national dealer teams. The most successful of these this year has undoubtedly been the British end. The Ascona 400, a car with tremendous spectator appeal and much unrealised potential, has carried Jimmy McRae to the British Championship. One feels the Ascona 400 should have done more whilst it was around, but we look forward to its replacement, a lighter Manta 400, which will attempt to beat the supercars through conventional engineering and consequent reliability. The Chevette is now well developed and a superb forest racer, in addition to its well-known supremacy on tarmac. Vauxhall's days as a separate name within GM are numbered, and it is pointless advertising through rallying around the world a car which is only marketed in Britain. What a pity, as the sight of an HSR round the twists of Corsica would be really something. The poor Toyota team seem to struggle very hard to achieve the few minor placings which come their way. Drivers like Voldegaard and Eklund have the ability to win events given a competitive mount. The car is relatively underpowered, though not as heavy as it looks. The truth of the matter is that unless they come up with something new, it will, with the revised regulations of 1982, be even more outclassed. Mitsubishi have brought a new car to the scene during 1981. The Colt Turbo Lancer has an onboard computer to control its 280 brake horsepower, and the car is certainly fast in a straight line. Its handling and Japanese Yokohama tires are probably the areas needing the most development, and results could well come. Having overheated and retired early on the Acropolis, the cars were a model of consistency in Finland, where they finished 10th, 11th and 12th. On the RAC, Andrew Cowan went out after the second of two rolls, and Antero Liner suffered a broken oil cooler in Wales. Kulang, with a car bent on every corner, made it to the finish in 9th place, so there is some promise there. Further development could well see this team as the top Japanese marque before long. We've seen many other makes and models during the year, and here are 28 of them. Mazda, Lada, Mini, Triumph, Skoda, Wartburg, Trabant, Subaru, Honda, Saab, Volvo, Land Rover, Lancia, Porsche, Polonaise, Fiat, Peugeot, BMW, VW, Corolla, TR7, Cadet, Avenger, Fiesta, Sprinter, Starlet, and, it says here, something called an Isuzu Gemini.